On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 23, The Final Search. The quiet of the First Believers' Church was comforting, but tonight it felt heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Dusty, Megan, Roxy, and Pastor Ethan sat in the pews, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. The sanctuary, usually a place of refuge, now seemed like a battlefield awaiting its soldiers. The air was thick with unspoken fears, but each of them knew that there was no turning back. This mission, this final search for Mila, could be their last. Dusty leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. His mind was racing, trying to process every detail, every lead, every dead end they had chased over the past few weeks. Jackson's grip on the city was tighter than they had anticipated, and despite their efforts, the location of his headquarters remained a mystery. "We're close," Dusty said, his voice low but determined. "We've come too far to stop now." Megan, sitting beside him, nodded, her face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She had been relentless in her pursuit of the truth, digging deeper into Jackson's operations than any journalist had dared. But even her best sources had come up short. They were running out of time. Roxy, her hands trembling slightly, glanced at Dusty, then at Ethan, who sat across from her with his usual calm demeanor. The weight of her past was heavy on her shoulders, but she knew she wasn't that broken woman from the alley anymore. She had been saved, and now she wanted to save Mila. "We have to trust that we'll find her," Ethan said softly, his voice like a steadying hand. "This fight isn't just about us. It's about something greater, something that's guiding us." Dusty's jaw clenched as he fought the uncertainty gnawing at him. His powers had grown stronger, and he had witnessed things that defied explanation. But now, on the cusp of the final confrontation, he felt that familiar doubt creeping in. Was faith really the key to all of this? Or was it just desperation disguised as hope? Roxy broke the silence, her voice shaking slightly. I think we need to pray. For guidance. For the location." Dusty's head snapped toward her, and he saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She had come a long way, finding strength in the prayers that had once seemed impossible for her. But there was still fear there, a fear Dusty understood all too well. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know if prayer is going to solve this, Roxy." Roxy looked down, the uncertainty weighing heavily on her. "I don't either," she admitted. "But I don't know what else to do." Ethan stood, his movements slow and deliberate, as he walked to the front of the sanctuary. "Faith isn't about knowing the outcome," he said, turning to face them. "It's about trusting that there's a path forward, even when we can't see it." Roxy's eyes filled with tears as she bowed her head. "Please, God," she whispered, "show us the way." Before anyone could respond, the doors of the church crashed open with a violent bang. Dusty's heart lurched as 6 men stormed inside, 3 from the front, 3 from the back. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold, and their guns were drawn. "Get down!" Dusty shouted, springing to his feet, but it was too late. The men moved swiftly, their guns already trained on Dusty. In the blink of an eye, 6 shots rang out, the deafening sound echoing through the sanctuary. Dusty didn't even have time to react. He felt the impact of the bullets hit him, his body collapsing to the floor with a sickening thud. He gasped for air, but it was no use. He could feel the life slipping from his body, the darkness closing in around him. The sanctuary fell silent. Roxy screamed, her voice filled with raw, unfiltered terror as she scrambled toward Dusty's motionless body. "No! Dusty!" Megan froze, her breath caught in her throat as the horror of what had just happened sank in. Dusty was dead. There was no doubt. His chest was still, his eyes closed, and there was blood. So much blood. Ethan knelt beside Dusty, his face etched with grief, but there was a calmness in his expression that defied the moment. He closed his eyes, his hands resting on Dusty's lifeless form as he whispered a prayer. The men, Jackson's soldiers, stood over them, their guns still raised, their faces devoid of emotion. One of them, the leader, judging by the cold glint in his eyes, stepped forward, a sneer twisting his lips. "No prayers will save you now," he hissed, his voice filled with malice. Roxy, Megan, and Ethan were forced to kneel at the altar, their hearts pounding as the men circled them like predators. 2 guns were trained on Roxy, 2 on Megan, and 2 on Ethan. There was no escape. The end was coming, and it was coming fast. Roxy's body shook with sobs, her mind racing, desperately trying to find a way out. Megan's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Ethan remained calm, his lips moving silently as he prayed. The leader's voice cut through the tension, counting down slowly. 3, 2. The sound of the guns cocking made Roxy's heart stop. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands trembling as she whispered her final prayer. 1. The trigger was pulled, but nothing happened. Roxy opened her eyes, confusion and terror swirling in her chest. The men stared at their guns in disbelief, pulling the triggers again and again, but the weapons refused to fire. And then, a voice, a thunderous, commanding voice, filled the sanctuary. "Let my people go." Roxy's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the source of the voice, her eyes widening in shock. It was Dusty. He stood at the center of the sanctuary, his body whole, unscathed. The blood that had covered his chest was gone. His clothes were clean, and not a speck of dust marred his skin. His face was calm, but his eyes blazed with an unearthly light. The men stumbled back, their faces twisted in fear as they realized what had happened. Dusty wasn't just alive, he was something more, something they couldn't understand. Dusty raised his hand, and with a single motion, the guns were ripped from the men's hands, clattering to the floor as if pulled by an invisible force. The men's eyes widened in terror as they scrambled to retreat, their courage shattered by the sight of the man they had just killed standing before them, whole and powerful. Without a word, they turned and fled, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets as they disappeared into the night. Dusty stood there, his chest heaving, his hands trembling slightly as the last remnants of the power faded from his body. He looked down at his hands, disbelief flickering in his eyes. He had done it again. Another miracle. Roxy, her face pale and tear-streaked, slowly rose to her feet, her eyes locked on Dusty. How are you alive?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dusty didn't answer. He didn't know how to. All he knew was that someone, had intervened. Something beyond himself. Megan, still shaking, knelt beside one of the fallen guns, her eyes catching on a small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the note. Roxy stepped closer, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What does it say?" Megan turned the note over, her breath catching in her throat. Her voice was barely a whisper as she read the words aloud. "Jackson's headquarters." Roxy's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing. Where is it?" Megan flipped the note over again, her eyes widening as she saw the address scrawled in messy handwriting. She looked up, meeting Dusty's gaze with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's an abandoned high-rise on the south end of the city," she said, her voice filled with quiet disbelief. "We know where Jackson is." Dusty nodded, his jaw clenched as the weight of the moment settled over them. The final search had begun,